Good morning, YouTube. How we doing today? It's Tuesday here in the Midwest of the United States of America, 2020. They always say, may you live in interesting times. And I think we've got that in spades. You gotta make the best of it, you know. Just kind of take it in. Try to put your perception cap on and glean through the information. There's probably some seeds of truth in there, some nuggets, little chunks that you can gestate on. But, man, there's a lot of extrapolating going on in the news and in politics to kind of cloud, obfuscate the genuine narrative. And I will promise you one thing, that underneath all this, somebody's making some bucks. The virus, the protests, Black Lives Matter, the shootings, somebody somewhere is making money. It's just, history always reveals it. You might not know it in the present, you might not even see it in the present, and it's hard to see it, because we in the trees, we don't see the forest. But when you look at history, what it dictates, what it demands, is that somebody somewhere is getting paid. And I don't know, I don't have no information that is secretly telling me that. History's telling me that. History's telling me somewhere, somebody with some real power is playing the cards the way they're playing them. Because for the next coming century, this is how they need to make their money. So they got to shift some things around here in the present day world and take some power away from some who had a little. Your government might have had a little bit of power. I mean, your democracy had a little bit of power. Your company, your state, your town, you might have had some power. But somewhere somebody's wrestling more of that power from you. And they generally do it by siphoning off tax dollars. So that provision that would be giving us what freedom looks like, and that provision tax base that should be providing equality, opportunity, and safety, that money doesn't make it to the people. And the people who steal it usually make the government look inept. They corrupt. They got a game plan. They steal them from you. They got a conspiracy. But real of it is, those people in Congress, they puppets too. They've been manipulated too by some behind the scenes machines. And so when some virus come along, or some terrorists come along, or some enemy come along, they just as scared as the rest of Joe Public. So they say, yeah, go to war. Yeah, assassinate them. Yeah, bomb that shit. Torture them. We sign up for shit when we scared. We give away freedom when we scared. And so whenever there's some real shuffling of the deck going on, and some fear being mongered, better raise an eyebrow, because somewhere somebody's paying for this to be done so they can reap a big harvest. And I've heard that the Federal Reserve has hijacked the tax base here in the billions of dollars in a few large payouts. And I'm not super knowledgeable. I saw a little video on it. But I did hear about these kind of big billion-dollar payouts to upper elite financial systems that will never come back into the regular tax base and economy of this country. They're robbing this tax base and providing us less. And that's just going to keep the streets hot. It's going to keep the tensions high. The division gets wider because the more both sides struggle, the more they can point the finger at each other and be like, if it wasn't for you, if they wasn't you doing what you're doing, I'd maybe be coming up. Stop looking at your enemy because they ain't your enemy. Never in history have one poor group and another poor group who battled each other, never have they been responsible for the pain of the other group. Somebody else is tinkering, making you think that so-and-so out to get you, and then you go beat each other up, and I'm going to come in and sweep up all your pieces. I'll take that, and I'll take that. Thank you very much, dumb motherfuckers. Played. I don't even know why that came out. It just did. I gotta keep myself sane sometimes, so I talk to you about how I feel. And this is how I feel sometimes Tuesday morning. Coffee in me. Today we're gonna talk about Bill Evans. Today we're gonna talk about the great, amazing Richard Evans. I think it was William Richard Evans. Bill, he's a special guy. I don't think any player in jazz has benefited more from the gravitational pull of the Miles Davis universe. He plays with Miles very briefly. 58 for 6 months. Comes back at 59 to help with Kinda Blue. He's on 4 of the 5 tracks, I believe. They give Wynton back his chair for one of them. The Freddie Freeloader Wynton plays on. I can't remember. But Bill Evans, from that little window of work, has become one of the great luminaries, not only of the 60s when he went to Verve and sold a lot of records, but the modern day collector. His stuff is always being reissued by different series and reissue groups, and his original material, especially his Riverside stuff, goes for big money. Big money. And he's one of the great, if not the greatest, quote-unquote white jazz musician. He's definitely the most collectible white jazz musician. He's really ascended into the ranks of the elite in terms of what his records fetch, those old Riversides especially. He has a struggle from his youth that will inform some of his playing and some of his personality and drive some of his beautiful malady. I didn't say melody, I said malady. There's a beautiful sickness to Bill Evans. I kind of recognize that the world's fucked up, but I can't really stick my finger into it and do nothing about it. I'm just going to sit here and paint some somber tones. And Miles also gave him some verbal credit, which I believe on the Waltz for Debbie record. It's on, Everybody Digs Bill Evans. One of the most refreshing pieces I've heard in many years. There's that longer quote where Miles talks about cascading rivers of crystal clean water and how he had to change the sound of his group to go that direction. So Miles, as big as his sphere is in the universe of jazz, collectors discover Bill Evans through Miles all the time. And not only does Miles verbally praise him and validate him, not just as a white musician, but as a musician, period, and changes the course of his own group, Miles also includes him on what's probably the most important jazz record of all time, certainly the most known jazz record of all time from this era anyway, Kinda Blue. And so Kinda Blue is so huge that it conveyed a new collectors to jazz perspective, and Bill Evans is a name you're going to see pretty much right off the bat. And so it drives up the price of his old stuff. He's definitely made him, like I said, no one's probably benefited more from Miles' influence, commercially speaking, than Bill Evans. And he was with Miles such a short period of time. It's pretty nuts. But the other interesting thing I kind of come to realize making this episode, and this has been happening to me kind of a lot recently, and something I need to dig into a little bit more and probably do an episode on, is once again, another great pianist, New York area. Count Basie, New Jersey. Horace Silver, Connecticut, right next to Westchester County in New York State, right next to the city. Bud Powell, Herbie Nichols, Elmo Hope, the great Thelonious Monk, Bill Evans, Plainfield, New Jersey, North Plainfield, New Jersey, born August of 29. There's something about New York. It seems like most of the great horn players come from other places. New York, perhaps it's just the grandeur and the scale of the place and the complexity that the city persists in, that it draws maybe musical minds to the piano, because the piano can arrange and orchestrate like no other instrument in jazz. It's a higher level intelligence in a way, because you're not just playing one note at a time like all your other players are. You know, your bass player, your trumpet players, your sax player, they're all playing single notes. A piano player can play chords, and it can play low-end block rhythm with high-end virtuosity with the right hand on the upper levels. It can be an ensemble in itself. Ellington's shown us that. It's such an interesting thing that so many of the great jazz pianists come from New York. And my take before I kind of came to this was it was surprising how few of the great jazz players were from New York. None of the great horn players, with the exception of Sonny Rollins and a few others, but you know, they're much more second and third tier. Most of the great horn players come from other places. But when I look at the piano players, it's an incredible list. And I'm sure the list is going to keep growing as I dig deeper into these biography episodes. But, so Evans is from the New Jersey area. His father was Welsh, an immigrant. He was a bad drunk. He was very abusive. And he was also a gambler. And things were so bad at home that Bill Evans' mom, who was our Carpathian Russian, which is kind of a subgroup of Ukrainian Slavic peoples that occupy a lot of Eastern Europe. Not a super important fact, but it's a impoverished group, and she comes from a long line of coal miners. So you got a drunk Welsh American and a poor coal mining lineage from his mother's family. Things were so bad at home, Mom often picked Bill and his brother up and went to her sister's house in Somerville or someplace like that, not that far away in New Jersey, where Bill starts picking up piano because his older brother's getting piano lessons. And Bill also dabbles in other instruments. He starts becoming accomplished enough that he starts playing parties, charging $1 an hour to play boogie woogie and just kind of entertain people, which shows you he's got a skill set kind of right off the bat. He goes to music school. He hears Dorsey's on the radio, which really impacted him. He's also hearing Stravinsky in music school, learning the modern classical and the classical arts like Mozart as well. And he is just taking all this stuff in. And he remembered his music teacher wasn't super concerned about a lot of the complications. He was kind of keeping it simple for him, which I think he applies that to jazz in a lot of ways. So he's in school in the probably 1944, 43. He actually meets a young Don Elliott, who he ends up playing with later in the 50s, who is the fantastic multi-instrumentalist, also a white guy. He's hearing on the radio Earl Father Hines, Coleman Hawkins, Bud Powell, George Shearing, Stan Getz, Nat Cole. These are all the people that he says he was listening to, and they were impacting his interpretation of jazz. And if you think about Hines, Hawkins, Powell, Getz, Nat Cole, these are all the melodic players that are going to give you hummable melody. And he's becoming acutely aware of it. He also learns and studies about some of the harmonic branches you could take in the music. So he's becoming kind of a musical theoreticist as well. But somehow he's got enough sorrow in his background that he's also got a bluesy, gutsy feel to his playing. And that abusive father and the alcoholism and the poverty that their lineage comes from, you can tell that he's got some familiarity with that, and it probably makes him more comfortable around the black community, which was still very divided and segregated. And Patterson, from my understanding, has some black neighborhoods in it, so I'm guessing he was fairly comfortable with black from early on. Poor white kids and black kids often play basketball together and stickball, you know what I mean? There's a commonality there. In 46, he goes to university in southeastern Louisiana. And I'm not sure where that would be, but that's Monroe's and near Baton Rouge. I'm not sure. But he ends up meeting Mundell Lowe, and he starts a trio with Mundell Lowe, Bill Evans, and Red Mitchell. That's some pretty serious talent. They end up moving back to New York. They can't find much work in New York, and so they go to Chicago, do some playing there. He ends up on the West Coast in 1950, I believe it was. Played 6 months with Billie Holiday. So he's getting more of the blues and the melodic sense of the music, and even Billie Holiday's harmonic choices at times. She'll pick intervals that are what you don't really expect, but she'll do it in such a minimal way and a haunting way that little change of harmony there is like, ooh, you just kind of changed the meaning of that lyric. He composes Waltz for Debbie in 1953 for his niece. As a young musician, long before he's discovered, he's already composing and making important compositions. And of course, that's a standard today. You go to see a jazz trio quartet play, and there's a great chance Waltz for Debbie might come up. So he starts smoking weed actually in 53 as well, which I think has some interesting significance. Like Armstrong said, once you become a Viper, you're part of the crew. We trust you on a different level once we smoke with you. You know, if you leave the room every time we smoke a joint, we're not too sure about you. But if we spark up and light up an owl, and you hoot on that thing, there's a camaraderie that comes. It's as silly as kind of breaking the law together. It just builds a bond. But I thought it was interesting that Wikipedia mentioned that he started smoking weed in 53, and I think that it's probably got some significance if it's in there. You know, he's playing tuxedo gigs around New York and Chicago, where you put on a fancy dress and you go play at some person's event, make a few bucks, and he's not really making much headway. He ends up playing in 54 in Greenwich Village with Don Elliott and with Tony Scott and Mundell Lowe and a few other cats as well. And it's interesting because these are all interesting white cats: Mundell Lowe, Don Elliott, Bill Evans, and Tony Scott. And they're all kind of creative minds, arrangers, composers. It's a pretty talented young group, but they weren't getting much recognition. He actually received some criticism, and he takes a year off, doesn't play. People are like, this guy can't play, he's whatever. And even Orrin Keepnews, when he first introduced to him, was like, I don't know. But he kind of grows on you. Anyway, in 55, he gets his first recording session. He comes back, and he also meets Monk at this point in 54, 53. He meets Monk. And that's one of the common threads here that we got in all these great New York jazz pianists. Bud Powell, he met Monk. Alma Ho, he met Monk. What's his name? Herbie Nichols, he met Monk. I think even Horace Silver, they say in there, he meets Monk. And Monk just has this almost fatherly figure over the jazz world, especially with New York pianists. I think he's really having an impact, and it's impacting composition, it's impacting the blues, and the slice of the avant-garde that Monk brings to the music, those left turns, those strange blocks. All the players that come after him adapts variations of that. And so you hear that in Powell, you hear that in Elmo Hope. And of course, those guys also influenced Monk, many people say. But it's clear in Evans that some of his spatial recognitions lead back to Basie, lead back to Monk. Because space allows something to breathe. It creates pattern and groove. It's super important. In 55, he records this great Dawn session, A Message from Garcia with Dick Garcia. Fantastic session. Some great talent on here. Gene Quill's on this. Terry Pollard plays piano. I think maybe Vibes on a track. Frank Isola, Dick Garcia, Bill Evans, Jerry Bruno. Mostly white cats, I think. Yeah, I think it's pretty much all white cats. Terry Pollard might be a sister. I know it's a gal, Terry Pollard. But great record. I play this a lot at my brunch gig when I used to have it. I hope that comes back. We'll see. But beautiful cover. It's Dawn number 1106. So probably 55. And he might have recorded one session before this, but there's some debate about it. I have this one. I don't have the other one. But beautiful stuff. And Evans is already kind of illustrating the player he's going to be on some of these tracks, but it's certainly not challenging music in any way. But it's in 56 where he's introduced, he's singing with this Reed singer, Lois Reed, I can't remember her name, but he ends up being introduced to George Russell. And this was a big step in Evans' career. And Evans was clearly influenced by George Russell, but Evans' knowledge of Stravinsky and Mozart and a lot of the classical training he had allows him also to see and hear what George Russell's trying to do. And Russell has this magnus opus, his grand piece, his life's work, as they say, was the Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organization. And he's challenging the norm, saying we can play in this other chromatic scale and actually change the sound of the music, and actually some things will sound better. And I'm not going to say I super understand all the complexities of that. I do get it on some levels. I play enough music that I understand it, but this RCA had this jazz workshop series, and they're convinced to give George Russell this session. It's a great session. Art Farmer's on this. I believe Milt Hinton plays the bass. Barry Galbraith, Hal McCusick, Joe Harris is on the drums. It's a fantastic session. But Galbraith, Farmer, McCusick, Hinton, Evans, and Harris. It's fairly very ahead of its time. This is probably 56. 50, yeah, and it's it really has a big impact. And of course, Miles with Kind of Blue comes a couple years later, and everyone attributes Miles to Modal, but really it's Russell. And believe it or not, that's actually a black guy. He's a light-skinned brother, but the lighting and the way they show him there, you can't tell that's a brother at all. And I was deceived by that for a long time. I saw some other pictures finally online, and I'm like, oh, he's a lot blacker than they make him look. Shame on you, RCA. But that was pretty common to powder up a brother, whether it was Nat Cole, didn't matter. It was pretty commonplace to minimize the blackness of any artist, and even potentially be able to deceive people when they buy it. But he continues to do stuff with Russell. They make a couple other really important records here. These are both on Decca, and the first one was on RCA. But again, you're talking major label here with big distribution. These records probably didn't sell super well, but there's Bill Evans' name on the bottom. And that's probably where the average collector would look at this and be like, oh, you don't really know who George Russell is, but Bill Evans? That I know. And then again, great concert here. A lot of people were a part of that session. I was worried that was going to happen. Tony Scott, who he's playing with in 54 in the Village, he also is a part of this session. And this doesn't come out till quite a bit later, but I think it was recorded. I'm not sure when this is recorded, but it's got Clark Terry, Bill Evans, Milt Hinton, Paul Motion, Jerry Grimes, and Sahib Shihab. So I think it's probably recorded in the late 50s, but I'm not sure. There's got to be someone there that can tell me. He's also in the late 50s working with Jimmy Neppert. He's on the East Coasting record with Charlie Mingus. Here's a record on Decca with Hal McCusick. These guys meet each other and they work on each other's records. That's how it works. This is a great Joe Puma guitar section on Jubilee. It's still in its old wax paper. And this record is fantastic. It's got Eddie Costa, Pat Pettiford on one side. On the other side, it's got Bill Evans, Pettiford, and Paul Motion, who of course joins Bill Evans in his great trios. So he's doing some interesting side work here in the late 50s, and it's about this time where Mundell Lowe, who's now already made a couple records at Riverside, his former college buddy, fantastic guitar player. I love Mondello. He's telling Warren Keepnews at Riverside, you got to sign this Bill Evans kid. And Keepnews isn't impressed at first, but he actually hears Evans playing unbeknownst to Evans, and that's when Keepnews' ears get perked. He's like, oh, that's interesting. And what's mind-blowingly crazy about this is this Bill Evans' new jazz conception record that we think of as a staple of the average jazz diet. Okay? This is mind-blowing to me. This record did not sell well. And it actually gives a quantity. The number blew my mind. It says this record for Riverside sold 800 copies in its first year. And so if that's what a poor selling jazz record at one of these fairly big consequential labels sells, that tells me that probably Babyface will let when I read that those records didn't sell well, probably sold 800 to 1,000, 1,200 copies. If that's what, I didn't realize the bar was set that low. That anything in these classic series, 200 series at Riverside, the 7,000 series at Prestige, the 1,500 series, 4,000 series at Blue Note, I didn't think anything would sell as low as 800 copies in the first year. But there was a lot of piano players. He just didn't get noticed. As groundbreaking as this is, and isn't Waltz for Debbie on this? Sure is. It's become a standard and a classic of the industry at this point. But it's certainly a small number. Mind-numbingly small number. And so anyway, he gets that break with Riverside. And that's a really important step, being on Riverside, because now you're going to start having a community of other ascending players. And I think that's another thing we don't understand today, is that all the established jazz musicians that established themselves in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, by the late 50s, they're almost all either at Columbia, and especially the black artists, or at Verve with Norman Granz. You know, the Armstrongs, the Ellingtons, those guys, basically they have some stuff at Columbia. And then all the other greats, the Ellas, the Billie Holidays, the Roy Eldridges, the Lester Young, they're all at Verve. And so these discographies that we think of as the staple of the modern jazz universe, and we think these guys were giants in their day, almost all these releases that Riverside, Blue Note, Prestige are putting out, to the average consumer, they're all completely anonymous. And the Miles Davis, especially once he goes to Columbia, he becomes the exception. But Miles Davis on Prestige, again, they said Miles' good-selling records at Columbia sold 80 to 100,000. His poor selling records in the early 60s, late 60s sold 40, 30,000. And that's with national distribution. And I'm sure those numbers don't reflect career sales. That's some interesting stuff right there. That's some on the edge shit. Some different sounding shit right there. But if I now know that Evans' first record at Riverside sold 800 copies in the first year, I'm pretty sure it's safe to assume that the best-selling Blue Notes, Riverside's, Prestiges were probably selling 5,000, 10,000 copies, and in the first year probably a couple thousand, 4,000, 5,000 copies, and then you have a second, third pressing depending on the sales. But it was just kind of really eye-opening that a Bill Evans record, who we think of as one of the giants, sold only 800 copies. I don't want to harp on that forever, but it really kind of dropped my jaw. So anyway, he's doing the stuff with Russell. He's now at Riverside, which leads him to doing stuff with Johnny Pace and Chet Baker. He does a number of records with Chet Baker that are some of Baker's finest work. Fantastic records. He, of course, in '58, plays with the Miles Group for 6 months, which the second side of that record is fantastic. They record live at Newport in '58, and then they record the Jazz at the Plaza, which doesn't come out till much later. And then Evans leaves. But it's those fateful 6 months with Miles Davis that really make his career and have just the hugest impact on his ascendancy and his longevity. Because anyone who collects Miles, which again I've said 1,000 times is where most people are going to start, you're going to stumble on Miles' high praise of Evans pretty quick. It's a fairly off-quoted paragraph, and again, Kind of Blue was just so preeminent in the jazz universe that it just really launches Bill Evans' trajectory. And he makes some really fantastic... Where did they go? One second. He makes some really fantastic records coming up. But because of his affiliation with Miles, he gets to know Cannonball Adderley fairly well. He plays with him on this Mercury session, probably from '58. He plays with him on this fantastic Riverside session, probably also from '58, '59, '58. And then this session comes a little bit later. You know what I mean, with Bill Evans. It's probably recorded in '62, I'm guessing. It's 433, so it's definitely a lot later in the Riverside discography. He shows up with Helen Merrill on this fantastic Emercy session, which probably has something to do with him coming to Mercury and working with Adderley. One of my favorite records of all time, Art Farmer, Modern Art. This record should be in every collection. It's outstanding. Evans is a big part of that. Gunther Schuller, John Lewis, and Bill Evans, an interesting record. And then Oliver Nelson, The Blues and the Abstract Truth, a legendary session. Evans is a big part of that as well. So that's some of his important side work. But we're going to dig more now into his discography. These records are all standards. All this Riverside stuff I'm going to show you here, it's all been reissued numerous times and places, and has probably sold 100,000 copies of almost all these records. And it's just beautiful stuff. After this session at the Village Vanguard, about a week later, Scott LaFaro, the fantastic Evans bass player from the trio, dies in a car accident. And Evans is devastated. And Evans doesn't come out of seclusion for months. And he just doesn't seem like he's going to be able to go on. And it's a really tough blow. And LaFaro's an amazing player. He really added a lot of punch and character, and was as much the lead soloist on a lot of that stuff as Evans. And they were just dynamic together. And I don't think he pained for his friend, but he also pained for the loss of his great art partner. You know, that's a double blow, you know, and it does take him a long time to finally replace him with Chuck Israels. And Israels comes into the picture, thank goodness, and Evans continues. And like I said, this line of Riverside stuff, some with LaFaro, some with Chuck Israels, it's all leading the pack. It's fantastic trio stuff. He doesn't step outside of the trio setting very often. I have a lot of these records on CD. I play them in my car, kind of non-stop. They're just beautiful. And there's a sorrow in his playing that's completely informed by the poverty of his childhood and the abuse from his drunk dad. Like, these things inform us as musicians. A lot of the times it's what drives us to be musicians, because it offers us an escape, a salve for an open wound. When I'm playing, I find a serenity and a calm and a place that I can't get to in real life. And whether it's the black of your existence or it's just the sorrow of being afraid of your father, music is a powerful medication. And we should all never forget that. And his legacy at Riverside, this is number 428. It's all these records, all of them are worth finding. This is actually a different type of session. He adds Freddie Hubbard, his buddy Jim Hall, the guitar player, Philly Joe Jones, and Percy Heath. Not a standard affair at all for what Evans normally offers us up, but it's a cool record. And I can't remember whose idea this session was, whether it was Keith News or Bill. It's a cool record. I've listened to it quite a lot, and I just can't remember exactly what leads him to doing something that's fairly in left field for him. But again, it's not like it's avant-garde or nothing. It just has less room for him. You know, How My Heart Sings, Bill Evans Trio. I think this comes out after he leaves Riverside. And same with this one, Shelley's Manhole, Hollywood, California, 487. Once you get into the late 400s, Riverside's usually kind of closed its doors, and they're still putting out stuff from the vaults. This is the Village Vanguard record, part 2. Actually, I think it's just the same record as the Village Vanguard, just reissued, which jazz loves to do. In 1959, United Artists launches a jazz workshop label, as it were, of their own, and all this United Artists jazz stuff, some pretty serious titles. This is him and Jim Hall, the guitar player, and they just weave and meander through wonderful fields of sonic grain, and it's quite the journey. I will say, to be honest, that some of my United Artists jazz records have some issues sound-wise, especially that jazz series, that 5000 series, I think it is. 15, I think it's 14 for mono, 15 for stereo, or maybe it's 15 for mono, 16 for stereo. I don't remember. But anyway, some of the records in this title, my Mingus Ellington Max Roach record doesn't always sound that great either. This is also a Bob Brookmeyer, Bill Evans piano duo record, the Ivory Hunters, Percy Heath and Connie Kay. And it's interesting that Bill would do this record with Brookmeyer, who's normally a trombone player, most people know, and it's actually a pretty cool record, but certainly not one of the first you need to get. So Evans is having some fairly significant success at Riverside, but as I've stated before, when you're at these, what we think of as major labels, in the jazz universe, what's major and important in jazz versus what's nationally well known is two very different things. And without any doubt in my mind, I can tell you that your financial standing when you're at Riverside or Blue Note, you might be making a living, but you're not getting rich. And a lot of these guys aren't necessarily doing it to get rich, but you still got bills to pay and families to feed, habits to enforce. And Creed Taylor, the great jazz producer, session organizer, has moved from Bethlehem on to Impulse, and he's left Impulse now because Train was a little too much for him. He's now at Verve. Norman Granz kind of gets stepped aside. Verve kind of dumps a lot of the swing era cats mistakenly, and Verve now is going in a new direction. They hired Jimmy Smith away from Blue Note. They hired Wes Montgomery away from Riverside. Kyle Jader away from Fantasy. They just kind of hijack a lot of the great talent that's bubbling on the surface and ready to go big. And Bill Evans also gets jacked by Verve and taken over. By Verve, taken from Riverside, and it's a devastating blow to Riverside, just like Jimmy Smith leaving Blue Note was devastating for Blue Note. But I'm going to kind of flip through his Verve material, and I want to start by stating this. Verve series after 8500, once the Creed Taylor is in full effect, which is like mid 84, 84, 60 or something like that, once Creed Taylor comes over and that new sound comes in, he takes artists like Wynton Kelly and Wes Montgomery and puts them a lot in schmaltzy settings. Wes Montgomery's playing California Dreaming. You know, it's not always the best thing for these musicians, even though they're getting paid more. Some of the Wynton Kelly stuff, they put strings on it, and it's Creed Taylor trying to make a buck, trying to get white people to buy it. And so they end up doing some schlocky stuff. And Bill Evans is the great exception. Bill Evans doesn't compromise his music in any way when he goes to Verve. He doesn't make commercial schlocky sessions. He doesn't force to do Christmas records like Jimmy Smith did. He's not doing, you know, the big hits of Broadway or Beatles stuff. He's doing Bill Evans music. And whether that was a part of his contract when he signs with Verve, I don't know. This is his first record on Verve, 8526. Puts it probably in 63. Yep, January of 63. And he's a fine young man at this point. Looking pretty cool. Looking like he could be in a noir film. But this record is actually a conversation with himself. It's him playing overdubs on top of himself. And so there's multiple versions of him playing here at times, which I've said from the record is kind of anti-jazz in a way. But Tristano did it, and Tristano was very inventive with how he did it. And Evans is also doing a pretty good job here. It's not like he's just using it to fix mistakes. He's using it from a compositional place where he can play with himself and improvise off of his own playing. So it's a bit of a different ball of wax. But that being said, it is overdubbed. This Trio 65 record, I absolutely love this record. It's one of my favorite on Verve. I'm trying to remember who else is on this. Gary Peacock and Paul Motion, yeah. I thought it was still Motion for sure. Great record. The Stan Getz art from the Bossa Nova stuff. Same artist, obviously. And this is definitely one of the Verve records that will kind of go more now. I've seen this one go for 60, 80 bucks at auction, which is high for a Verve record. And of all the great Verve titles that come out in the Creed Taylor era, most of it's more coffee table, beautiful cover jazz that white people can play in their new suburban track home. It's not going to be very Blackish. It's going to be Peter the Wolf safe. Like they had Jimmy Smith do Peter the Wolf. Evans doesn't ever drink that Kool-Aid. He stays very much true to his art. And this is another one that can go for 60, 80 bucks for a great old pressing. And his body of work at Verve is fairly outstanding. Bill Evans with the Symphony Orchestra. Intermodulation, Bill Evans with Jim Hall again. Beautiful, beautiful record. Love this one. Shelly Manne, Eddie Gomez, and Bill Evans. Gomez joins Bill in about 66, I think, and stays with him for a long time. Another really great session. Bill Evans at Town Hall, the trio. And by the late 87, 8800s, the further conversations with myself, Bill Evans at the Montreux Jazz Festival, Verve starting to come to an end. We're getting into 69, 70, 71, and the volume that Verve's selling jazz-wise in the 8000 series is really dwindling, and they actually start forcing a lot of back catalog stuff to come out. So there's Bill Evans Alone, 87, 92, these late 87, 50 through 88, 50, there's a lot of Bill Evans and Jimmy Smith and artists like that. They're just kind of getting all that material out. 8803, the Bill Evans Trio Live with Chuck Israels and Larry Bunker. This is Montreux 2, and this is on CTI, which again is Creed Taylor. So he must have had some understanding or simpatico with Creed Taylor, but again, that Montreux Festival, Creed Taylor can't produce a live show too much. He can't meddle too much. And that's where my collection of Bill Evans ends. But Evans by no means ends here. He goes on and records endless stuff in the 70s, into the 80s. I think he dies around 1990, if I recall. I didn't write it down. But he's truly one of the great luminaries of this music. A guy that I can't recommend his stuff enough to even the biggest beginners. He's the most important white artist, probably. Certainly the most collectible white artist by a large stretch. But the gap between him and second place is pretty voluminous. There's a few other cats that sell for decent bucks as white jazz players, but nothing really close to Evans. But he left a great mark on the music. Miles gave him to all of us by promoting him like he did and having him on his landmark session. And probably not knowingly, but Miles really made Bill Evans' career in so many ways. So thanks to Miles for that. And he probably had a pretty big impact on Miles too, in order to get such praise from Miles. When Miles changes his group to adapt to what you do, you're probably doing something. But I love Evans' stuff. The Verve stuff is actually great value. A lot of those Verve titles can be had for $10 to $30, $40, depending on the seller, depending on the condition. But if you go into a record store, chances are those records will be there. They used to be $5, $6 for years, but now with the demand and vinyl being so cool again, they're probably going to be $15 to $30, most of them. Some of them will push 40, 50 in the retail environment. And I said I've seen a few of those Verves go for 60, 80 bucks at auction when there's people trying to outbid each other. But those Evans stuff are a great value compared to the Riverside stuff, which is really difficult to get original Bill Evans records. Beat up copies will sell for hundreds of bucks, and I don't want to spend $600 on a record that sounds like shit. You know, I don't mind spending $6 on a record that sounds like shit, just so I have the old one and I can listen to it and feel it and touch it, and it might snap, crackle, pop a little bit, but I'll put my OJC on if I need to, but I'm not going to pay $600 for that. And it's just kind of gotten wild out in crazy land. So anyway, appreciate you all. Bill Evans. I've been excited about doing this episode for a long time, but there's so many great artists, and I'm trying to intersperse lesser known with more well-renowned, try to kind of balance out my viewership. I got some cool things in the works as well. I'll talk to you more about that coming up, but I'm going to start a Patreon site, and I got some bonus material that's going to go there, kind of a jazz magazine journal thing. I got some guests that are going to be part of it. So I'll tell you more about that as we get closer to that coming to fruition. Appreciate you all, your support. This has given me a great focus, aside from the craziness in the world. I get to talk to you guys every day. And then you guys message me and we chat. And there's no place I'd rather be, honestly. I feel a whole lot more sane talking with you sane people than out there listening to the crazy out there. Y'all be safe. Peace.